Good morning, everybody. Today's title is Government. Isn't it interesting how we look at it in the Bible? Everything that talks about that we need to know is in the Bible. And one of the topics that talks about in the Bible is government. And the person that wrote this in Romans chapter 13 through 1 through 7 is Paul. And it's very interesting that he wrote this. In fact, every one of the disciples, even Jesus' time, they wrote about government and how they need to obey the government when the government is after them. In fact, it was the government that killed most of the disciples and apostles and the followers of Christ. And yet, they said, follow and obey the government. And he talks about this. And as right now in our time with the voting issue and all the politics that's going on, strongly they talk heavily about the separation of liberalism and conservatism. Well, the Bible tells us there's no such thing as a liberalism and conservatism. In fact, in everything that we do in our life, it doesn't talk about liberalism or conservatism. About the abortion issues, about the homosexual issues, about the many other different issues that they're talking about in our time. Bible does not talk about the liberalism or conservatism or Republican or Democrat. It talks only about the right and wrong. So that's what you're going to find out here today. What does the Bible say? What is wrong and what is right? Okay, next screen. Okay, as we talked about it right now. Bible doesn't talk about anything else other than what is right or wrong. Even like we talked about last week about the marriage and family structures. It doesn't tell you, what women's right is, what men's right is, what children's right is. It doesn't talk about anything. It just talks about what right is right and right is wrong. And the same thing with the government. So we're going to find out here today, what does the Bible say about the government? Keep it in mind. None of the government supported Christianity, especially 2,000 years ago. In fact, it was a Roman government that killed Paul. It was the Roman government that didn't encourage, but that kind of assisted in crucifixion of Jesus, right? And yet, you find that Jesus did not fight against the Roman government. They just went along. Every disciples, every apostles, even Jesus, you find that they all went along with what the government is doing. So that's what you're going to find out today. As far as in our time that we're living in our time right now, either it is a Christian government or not a Christian government, what does the Bible say that we need to do about following and living our life under the government structure? Well, here, as we read, first of all, it tells us that God is in control. Many people are terrified, or some of the people are really worried and scared about which president is going to become president, which person is going to become president, correct? We worry about, is it the Democrat or Republican, is it liberalism or conservative is going to be a president, will take control of this country. We know what? The Bible tells us, okay, that God is in control. Either it is a Democratic, either it is Republican, it is a liberalism or conservatism. It could even be a communism, it could be Nazism. It tells us that God is in control of everything. Yes, it does not make sense to me or to you. How could God approve communism? Or how could God approve Nazism? I don't know. But He tells us that God is in control of everything. And He tells us here in the next screen, okay, right here, God is in control. So He says here in Job 12:23, He makes nations great and destroys them. He enlarges nations and guides them. Also in Daniel chapter 2:21, and He changed the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. Throughout my adult life, I have seen, many presidents come and go. Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. Some of the presidents I like, some of the presidents I did not like. Some of the presidents that became president, some of the people that became president, I got really worried because, how could he ever rule the country? I was really concerned about some of the people that becomes a president. Yet He tells us God is in control. And when I look back of all those different people who became a president, they all have done something good. Regardless who they are, regardless what kind of character they are, they all have done something good to advance this country to the next level. Certainly some of the things they did, or some of the things they said, or some of the things the kind of character they are, of course I did not like, but they all have done something good. So when you look at that in perspective, God really is in control, and God is in control of everything that's going on around us. So you don't need to be concerned about or be in fear who the next president is going to be, okay, or what political party is going to take control. God is in control of everything. So here in Romans chapter 13, verse 1 through 7 that we just read, he tells us on the next screen, okay, what are we to do? You and I as a believer, first of all, we need to understand that God is in control, and we as a Christian, we need to follow what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us that we have to follow what the government tells us to do. So here in Romans chapter 13, 1, that God created governing authority. God created like our city government. God created the police officers. God created the fire department. God created the governors. God created the president. And that's what we need to all understand. So here in Romans chapter 13, 1, he says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that existed are appointed by God. So he tells us the authorities that police officer has on us, or the governor has authority over us, or the senators having the authority over us, and even the president having the authority over us. They all receive those authority because God gave it to them. Okay, it's not that they're God, but God gave them the authority to rule us, to control us, to keep everything in law and order. Like you're looking at police officers, when the officer tells us, a lot of times they don't have time to explain many things. So when they tell you to stay back, don't move, okay, there's a good reason behind it all. It doesn't mean that they're going to hurt you or harm you. They just don't have the time to explain to you why they're saying this. Or sometimes they tell you to come over here, stand over there, or stand over there. This is something that will happen to you, because before you even arrive, they get the information about a certain suspect, somebody that burglarized somebody, gave them a description. It could be someone that looks like you. Okay, you may not be the person, but he just got a verbal description of who you are. So when he sees you, he has to stop you and interview you. Okay, but a lot of people have a problem with this, and they are fighting against authority. So God tells us, okay, all the authority people in our country, okay, in the government people, are appointed by God. Okay, next verse, he tells us not to resist the authority. He says, therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Certainly, if you break the law, right, you go to jail, or you be penalized. Right now, your grandfather got a traffic ticket, and he went to the red light. He went to the stop sign, and he has to pay $280. Okay, that's how you get. If you break the law, you will be judged, and you will be penalized for it. And he tells us not to resist the officers, or not to resist the government rules and law and order. So as far as you and me goes, we need to follow what the Bible says. We need to follow what the law is saying the best way that we can. Next verse, it tells us, do what is good. Why? Because it brings praise to you. So he says here in 13:3, for rulers are not the terror to good works. Isn't that true? They're not there to destroy you. They're not there to ruin your life, but they're to do good things for you. Every day, senators and Congress, their job is to make laws all the time. All the rules that you guys have in your car, okay? Those are for your safety. When I was growing up, we didn't have a law against wearing a seatbelt. So for me, even now, it's very uncomfortable sometimes to put a seatbelt. So sometimes I forget, because I grew up all throughout my life, okay, without wearing a seatbelt. When I used to ride a motorcycle, can you believe that we didn't wear a helmet? It wasn't a law until it became a law. Did you also know that people smoked everywhere? Even in the plane, that's totally unthinkable now. But even in an airplane, people used to smoke cigarettes. And during that time, I didn't care. It didn't bother me, because everybody did it. But they made a law against that. Why? For the health of the people. So whenever the law comes out, whenever the order comes out, it's for your benefit. So the government people are not there to terrorize you, but the government is there to help you. So he says, for rulers are not terror to good works, but to evil. You do evil, they will come after you. Even in a communist country, the same thing. They break the law, the government will come after them. Do you want to be unafraid of your authority? Do what is good, and you have praise from the same. Okay, do good, and you won't be afraid. When you're driving a car, and suddenly a police officer is behind you, if you didn't do anything wrong, you shouldn't be afraid. But if you break the law, you'll be afraid. So he tells us to do good things. Okay, the next verse, on the 13:4, it says again, it says authority are God's minister. Okay, it's kind of hard to imagine some of the politicians, some of the officers to be thinking that they're a minister of God. But God has all given the appointment that they are the minister of God's work. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger, and execute wrath on him who practices evil. Or don't you, right now I'm watching a series called Chicago Police Department. Some of the things that they do is very, very violent, and I wonder to myself, how do they get away with all those things they do? But the person that's in the character in that Chicago Police Department, in the series that I'm watching, he's doing it. He says this: I am doing it for the people of Chicago. So he breaks all these rules. He hurts people, the criminals, to help other people. And sometimes they lie. They say, you lied to the suspect to find someone that was kidnapped. And you know what the officer says? Well, it was worth lying to save that person's life. So, those guys, the police officers and government, they do things to protect you. Okay? And if you do evil, they will come on and you be judged for it. Verse 5, he says also again that you are to live a peaceful life. How do you live a peaceful life? Well, do the right thing. 13:5, he says, therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for your conscience sake. If you keep the law, you have a peace in your heart, right? Well, every year, as you guys know, I write, income tax. And I try to do it the right way. And I could easily cheat in many things that I write in there, but I don't. Because I don't want the IRS to come after me a year or 2 years later and say, you made a mistake or you lied and you will be penalized for all this. Sometimes you don't pay property tax. Guess what the government can do? They could come and take your houses away. They could come and take away anything that you own, especially for the IRS, like income tax. If you don't pay your tax right and you cheated and you did not pay them what you're supposed to pay, they can come and take anything away from you. It's a very, very powerful organization. Well, you don't want that to happen, right? So he tells you that to have a peaceful mind, keep the law. Verse 6, he says to pay your taxes. Many people have a problem paying taxes. For he says, for because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Right now, Papa doesn't pay as much as I do when I was working. But when I was working, guess how much tax I was paying in all my income tax? 25%. Every time I make money, I had to pay 25% tax. And even that, people have a hard time doing this. Can you imagine trying to pay your tax 2,000 years ago? Like people like Paul and Peter and Jesus, they all had to pay tax. But they were not paying it to the Israel. Guess what they were paying it to? They were paying it to the conquered nation, Roman government. It wasn't even their country. But they had to pay their taxes to the Roman government. And when Paul wrote this, he wrote it during the time of Roman occupation. And even him at the time saying, pay your taxes. And if he had to pay his taxes to the nation that was conquered nation, how much more we need to do what we have to pay our taxes with the money that we have, okay, to the government that takes care of us. So the Bible tells us it's important that you pay your taxes. And verse 7, it says, behave as expected to authority. So you have, right now people are really, really, attacking like president, saying bad things about him. They don't know, but guess what? Guess what? They're breaking God's law. Okay? Even though you don't respect that person, because that person is in that position, it is required for all of us to show respect. He says here in verse 7, render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, custom to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Okay? So police officers, a lot of people disrespect police officers, right? That's against God's rule. We need to show respect to them. Even like we talked about earlier, as a president too, same thing. Some of the things that the President Trump says and does, really kind of a joke. But because he's in that position, we're required to show him his respect with that position that he's in. It is required for all of us to show that respect. Okay? Verse 8. Next verse. That's the end of it. But next verse, he tells us in 1 Peter 2:13, 17. Again, Peter is under the occupation of a foreign nation, Roman government. And yet he even says, okay, that we need to submit and follow the government because it is God's will. So here we will read 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 to 17. He says this, therefore, submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put into silence the ignorance of foolish men as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Okay? So we have to honor the government people. When you go to DMV office, there's all this requirement for you to take a written exam, eye exam, to drive properly, to get your driver license. What if you go in there and says, no, I'm not going to follow all your rules. I know how to drive. And that's so, do you think they're going to give you a license for that? No. We have to follow the rules of the land because this is God's will. Okay? It also says here in next screen that instead of attacking and accusing and disrespecting the government people, it tells us to pray for them. Pray for the police officers. Pray for the firefighters. Pray for the governors. Pray for the president. Okay? Instead of you arguing, fighting, trying to figure out what is right and wrong, this and that issue, this issue, before you do all these things, he tells us that we need to pray for them because they're God's given authority. That God has appointed his people. 1 Timothy chapter 2, 1-3. It tells us, therefore, I exhort, first of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving thanks be made for all men, for kings and all are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceful life. It's not what we want. We want a quiet and peaceful life. In all godliness and reverence, respect, for this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior. So for you and me right now, it is very important that we need to pray for our government. Whoever becomes president next year, we need to pray for them. It could be Joseph Biden. It could be Donald Trump. Okay, we need to pray for them. All right, and that takes away all my fear. That takes away all my worries. That takes away all my little mind, my small little mind, trying to figure out what is all going on. It tells us that we need to pray for our government people. And lastly, in Luke 20:25, okay, it tells us even Jesus was questioned about this. Because remember, during that time, like I said earlier, Jesus was living under the occupation of a foreign country that was hated by their own country, by the Roman government. Right now, let's say Russians or Chinese government have invaded our country here right now, and we are under the Russians or even Chinese. And they're making us pay taxes, not to this country, but to their country. How would you feel? Even under that circumstance, Jesus tells us that we need to follow their rule, that we need to follow their system. And even in this time right now, Jesus was asked by the Jewish leaders, the Israelites, because they're always hoping the Messiah will come and destroy the Roman government. So they came and asked Jesus and said, should we pay taxes to the Caesar, the Roman government? And Jesus said this, give to the government what it belongs to them, and give God what belongs to God. And this is how he said it in Luke 20:25. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, which is their money, okay, paying taxes, and to God the things that are God's, okay. So he's saying, whatever, if you're under any government, follow what the government says, but also you must do this, that you need to do what God is requiring you to do. If the government ever comes out and says, I need you to follow this rule, that law, we have to follow that rule and that law. In fact, every year, one of the things I dread about paying for, one of the taxes that I dread paying for, which is so high, is property tax. Okay, but I pay for that. In fact, I told you guys how much I paid. It is a big, significant amount of money that doesn't benefit me at all. But with that money, they do what they need to do to provide for school. They provide the road condition. They pay for the police officer. They provide protection for our life, right? So something that we have to do every year. A big, significant amount of money has to be paid. But also, we have to do what God is asking us to do, okay? Especially worshiping the Lord, praising God every Sunday. So Jesus here tells us, you live your life according to what government tells you to do, and at the same time, you have to do what God is asking you to do the same thing. Okay? So there's two different things, but we need to follow both. Do what is required for the government, do also what is required for God. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we want to pray before you, Lord. I want to thank you.